You got involved in Armstrongism, as it was, Worldwide Church of God, was it? Tell us why. What were you looking for, and how did you get involved?
Well, the thing is, I listened to the ship stations, which were on in the 60s, and Garnet Ted Armstrong was a very good preacher, and he didn't speak like a religious person. He spoke like an ordinary person, you know, and had humour and used slang, and he was very good, and he sounded like he knew what he was talking about, and it was very persuasive. And after a few months of listening to this, I sent away for the literature, and the literature was very impressive. It was colourful, it was full of facts, and you know, I just thought it sounded like, you know, it was free as well. So it was, it just looked better than any other Christian literature that I'd ever seen. And that all added up to the impression that it's probably right, you know.
Had you been looking for something, or was it simply because you heard it, or were you sort of seeking for something at that point?
No, I wasn't seeking for anything. I always felt that deep down I was a Christian. Deep down, well, let me put it this way, deep down I believed in God. I always did that, but I went to church, went to the Life Boys Brigade, and fell away from it, you know, and then this came along, and as I say, it was very seductive, very impressive, and the idea that you are right and everybody else is wrong, and that you're special, and this kind of thing. It was good.
And you got quite involved, didn't you, at that point?
Yeah, very involved, yeah, and became a member, and that involved a change of lifestyle, and it was a cult well, I've read a lot of books on cults and the characteristics, and Armstrongism certainly was that. It was a cult, it had a charismatic leader. Nothing against being charismatic, but it's how you use that power. And whether it was all done intentionally or with a cynical motive, I don't really know. Herbert Armstrong was a complex character. He was capable of being very compassionate, but he was also capable of being very, very harsh too. And so he wasn't a man of the people, whereas the person who came along later, when he died, Joe Tkach, he was more of an approachable person, a hands-on person.
And of course, I mean, you talk about Armstrong dying, I mean, that's when things really began to unravel, to change, whatever terminology you want. How did you view that? I mean, because things, probably little by little, but things were really going to change. I mean, as you lived through that, how did you view that? What were you feeling inside?
Well, for one thing, Herbert Armstrong taught that he wouldn't die until Christ returned. So you had all these prophecies that kept coming out that we heard about this morning. And every time a prophecy never happened, it didn't come to pass, there was always an excuse. And it's amazing how gullible we can all be. You know, you think that, you know, firstly, it was usually he would accuse the people. He would say, it was our fault, you know, that we weren't ready. And that was the reason Jesus didn't come. Or God has given us more time because we need to do something else to do the work. And my favourite excuse was actually, we forgot about the 7 years of Nebuchadnezzar's madness. There was always an excuse.
But, as I say, things began to change. And I remember from the outside reading about it, and you know, each time something new came out, they were changing the very fundamentals. As you said, interesting. You said we were different. You know, we were. Suddenly they were moving away from that being different to becoming similar to. How did you take that as somebody that had been quite heavily involved?
Well, I think that when well, we were shocked when Herbert Armstrong died. I mean, he was like a father figure or a grandfather figure. People would have pictures of him in their homes and stuff. So when he died, it was a shock. Everybody could remember where they were when they heard the news and so on. And the changes actually came little bits and pieces at first, and they were relatively minor. But it all built up to what was a historic, as it proved to be, 3-hour sermon that Joe DeCatch gave, in which he explained that we're now a New Covenant church, and in one fell swoop, he kind of nailed it to the wall in a Martin Luther sort of a way. He did away with all the Old Covenant stuff, the Sabbath and the holy days and everything like that, except tithing. And so it came, people think, wow, did he really say what I thought he said? And yes, he did. And it was a big shock, and it polarized people, is what it did. And mostly, whatever camp people were in, they stayed there. I don't know anybody who was initially against the changes who later came to accept them. They might have modified their views a bit, but never really accepted them. And so it's pretty much polar. Now, let me say this as well, something positive. I think that God did, in his graciousness, work a great miracle in the Worldwide Church of God, because I don't know of any other church, maybe you do, who's had changes of this magnitude. I don't know any other church. To me, it was just a miracle. And however, unless you act on those changes, Doug, nothing happens. And in America, they did. Largely, most of them, 70% or more, moved away from the Old Covenant days. In Britain, with our conservative attitude, and I mean Scotland and Ireland as well, and Wales, fairly conservative. And they thought, no, we're going to continue to keep the Sabbath and the holy days. And some of them kept it because they thought you still had to. Some of them kept it because they'd always done that. And so it became quite complex to sort out which was which. It just seemed to me that the cleanest way would be to move to Sunday. Not that it would be a panacea or anything like that, but at least you got rid of a lot of baggage when you did it. You signaled your intent that you're now focused on Jesus, saved by grace alone, not by works. That's very important. It took me 40 years to learn that.
I mean, you talked about the miracle, and certainly I think those of us that were involved in cult work in any way, and I mean, I've written umpteen articles about Armstrong, and just looked at all his teaching and showed how wrong it was. I think we looked on with absolute amazement. But I think the one thing which I think a lot of people struggle with, in the end, of course, Worldwide Church of God changed its statement of faith, and it became clearly an evangelical statement of faith. But that still had to be worked through in the hearts of the people. And I think some really had problems over that, didn't they? Because although the statement of faith had changed, they were still outward. They hadn't seen that inward salvation by grace alone.
Exactly. You can't impose something like that, really. You can tell them, you can teach it. But a lot of that teaching needed to be reinforced. You couldn't just do it in a 3-hour sermon, because it needed to be reinforced from the pulpit. And the ministers themselves either didn't agree with it or didn't know how to explain it. And so that led to confusion, and it led to sermons that were kind of in the middle somewhere, and it didn't satisfy anybody. And so what happened in a lot of churches in the UK is that the people who accepted the changes, who initially read about them and thought, yeah, I can't fault any of this, and accepted them, eventually they got fed up and left, because they could. But the people who didn't agree with them, who still felt that you needed the Sabbath and the holy days, they stayed because, they just felt, I'm going to stay and fight for the soul of the church. Of course, a lot of people left and joined splinter groups.
Yeah, I want to talk about that.
Yeah, but the last count I read somewhere, there's over 200. It's crazy, because for some of those people, the Sabbath and the holy days was not negotiable. It was not accepted at all. And partly you could understand part of it, the reasoning. I have some sympathy, because when you sacrifice so much over the years for the Sabbath and the holy days, whether it's careers or whether it's relationships or something else, then there's a lot riding on that. And there's a human tendency to defend it rather than say it's wrong. Jesus saved us. Jesus alone, saved by grace alone, by faith alone. Unless you can say that, then you're going to tend to defend your position, justify yourself.